Hey all, Josh here, and this is my review for the Twilight Saga Eclipse, the newest movie in the ever-growing and ever more popular Twilight vampire series. If you don't know what this series is about, well, I basically just summarized it for you. Vampires, also werewolves, and teenage romance thrown in for a soapy melodramatic mix. Now, far from being an insult, I actually am a strong proponent of this series. I'll be the first one to admit that it has major problems, but at the same time, in a trashy way, I just can't help but enjoy myself. It's like watching the Crank series, or the newest Punisher movie. You know it's not very good, really, but at the same time, it's a hell of a lot of fun, if you go into it with the right mindset. I stick by that. Anyway, to get to the meat of the review, the story this time is about the evil vampire Victoria, who has been hunting Bella in the previous two movies, and, well, I guess previous movie, really. Anyway, from the first movie, she is now creating an army of newborn vampires to go up against the now iconic Cullen clan, that now must join with the wolf pack from La Push and fight them off. And, of course, all in between this is Edward trying to marry Bella, Bella graduating from high school, and the whole Jacob love triangle and whatnot. Really, I don't know, this review is kind of pointless, because honestly, at this point, you should know if you like the series or not. I really don't have much respect for people that dislike this series, or dislike much of anything without trying it out for themselves first. So if you're just hating this on principle, what can I say? You gotta at least try these things out to know if you like it or not. If you don't, you know what, that's fine. It's very much an acquired taste. I realize I'm not the target audience, far from it, but I still find it enjoyable. Doesn't mean you can't either. Anyway, to get to the characters and to the story, I really did think this installment improved on the previous two movies quite a bit. Whether it's my favorite movie is up to question, but I'll get into a little bit more of that later. To start, like I said, I think this is definitely the most improved series of the franchise. The pacing is definitely helped out quite a bit by David Slade's insertion of action scenes that are only referenced in the novel, and definitely he improves on the running effects. While I was quite a fan of the stylized running effects of New Moon, he does revert back to the old Twilight ones, but he uses a lot of close-ups that make it seem much more realistic and frenetic, rather than the ridiculous shit that was the original movie. And I was also really appreciative of the handling of the flashback sequences, and this is definitely the movie the most plot-driven of the three movies, because there is a lot of character backgrounds here, and particularly Jasper gets a huge chance to shine, and outside of maybe, a ridiculous accent that came out of nowhere, at least from the previous two movies. I guess he didn't read that book before making them. Anyway, outside of his southern accent that just seemed to have popped up, and his hair changed, despite vampires supposedly never changing, he did a really fantastic job. He's actually a really great actor, I gotta say. I was pretty impressed. He really didn't have a whole lot to do in the previous two movies, and it kinda gets me interested, you know? What if you gave these people more to do? I really think the supporting characters in this franchise are actually probably the more interesting ones. Belle and Edward really pretty static archetypal characters, and while Jacob is at least an archetypal character, he has more of a human touch to him. Anyway, like I said, a lot more focus on these more interesting characters. There is a lot more action, and the romance is really cranked up to 11. It's basically everything that the Twilight franchise has always embodied, just done more of. Done in much better fashion, too. This has spent a lot more money on this movie, and you can definitely tell the scenery shots are definitely there. The same cinematographer from New Moon comes on again. He was absolutely fantastic there. He continues to be fantastic here from getting the Pacific Northwest really, really nicely. One thing I do really have to gripe on, though, is the return of the Twilight filter, and if you've seen Twilight, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If not, it's much like The Matrix, in that there is a color filter over the majority of the film, particularly pronounced this time. It is very bluish-gray, though not quite as outlandishly blue as the first movie. It is definitely noticeable, especially after New Moon went for a much more natural cinematography and environmental perspective, where they just had very lush colors, which I actually preferred, to be honest. And that is one definite flaw in this movie, I think, though that does account for an entirely personal opinion. But I suppose that's what this review is all about, right? Like I said, though, the effects are much better in this movie. They actually do something really interesting. In New Moon, they kind of... In Twilight, they said that vampire skin is hard as diamonds. And in New Moon, they kind of showed it, where they're just... Edward's face cracking at one point, and in this one, they really get down and dirty. And in the newborn attack, I'm not really spoiling much by saying that there is actually a surprising amount of violence in this movie. Particularly for something that is a PG-13 movie. It is actually, I mean, if it had blood, this would be a really fucking gory movie, which comes as quite a surprise considering the franchise's pedigree. But I mean, like, people kind of shatter like rock in this one, or more, like I said, more like diamond. So someone gets their head, half of their head punched off at one point. Someone gets beheaded via drop kick. It is really pretty fucking gory, and I really enjoyed that. It really brought a surprising weight to the material, actually. And like I said, though the development of these movies hasn't been really consistent, it added a much-needed impact to events, I think. Lastly, I wanted to get to sound. I guess lastly, the main categories is to get to the sound, and the score by Howard Shore I actually didn't really like all that much. I thought the person for New Moon did a lot better job. The name is escaping me at the moment, but yeah, I know Howard Shore is really famous for Lord of the Rings, but his score here just seemed rather pedestrian. It's not that it was bad, I guess, but it didn't really strike me. I mean, he did try and incorporate some of the songs from the actual soundtrack into his score, and that was neat. But otherwise, I didn't really even notice it. So I mean, I guess it helped the scenes, into the fact that it never distracted me. But I can't say much more than that. As for the actual soundtracks, the lyrical songs that they insert throughout the film, while a lot of people accuse the previous two movies of soundtrack shilling, they will probably not do the same for this, because while this does have a lot of songs interspliced throughout it, they are kind of mostly background noise, not really focused on, and I actually think that's kind of a shame, to be honest, because a lot of this series focuses on emotional connection, and you just can't really get that through as much in a big blockbuster movie. It's only 2 hours or 2-something hours long. I thought the music actually brought out a certain emotion to it. I actually did not think that it was soundtrack shilling, or at least in the second movie. So I was a little sad to see that the music wasn't featured as upfront here, but this movie does have a really great soundtrack nonetheless. It's pretty fantastic. It's a lot more folky than the previous soundtrack. And I just don't know if that's quite fitting, but all of the music featured in the movie, rather than just a soundtrack, does fit, particularly during a training scene. There's a great song that plays. It really gets your blood pumping. At least it did mine. And yeah, I thought overall it was pretty decent. But the score, somewhat of a letdown. Lastly, I do want to discuss some specific scenes as adaptations from the novel, and I won't really spend too much time on this because I don't want to spoil too much, and without spoiling things, it's going to be difficult to talk about much. But suffice to say, I really did enjoy the climactic battle. I thought they did a fantastic job there. I was a little worried that it would just be lame, but like I said, thanks to the increased violence level, it surprisingly was not. And as well, I was also really, really impressed with the tent scene, quote unquote, and really good dialogue in that. I haven't thought that Melissa Rosenberg as the screenwriter has been all that bad, considering. Don't get me wrong, a lot of the material isn't all that amazing, but I think majority of it comes from the book, which honestly is pretty soapy. So, like I said, I can't think of too many bad things to say for her in the previous movies, but this one, I actually think she does a really good job, and whether that's David Slade's direction and how the actors handle it, by the way, all their acting has improved, particularly Taylor Lautner. And actually, frankly, all of them really have. I didn't like Kristen Stewart as much, but I just don't really love Kristen Stewart all that much, regardless. And yeah, I think the screenwriting actually has a lot more fun, or a lot more humor in it this time, which is surprising considering the last movies have been almost completely devoid of humor. And yeah, I really enjoyed that because the books were quite humorous at times, and it's nice to see one of the movies, even if it is supposedly the most serious one, be spliced in with a little humor, particularly aimed at fans of the series that will get a lot of it. You've already seen one if you've seen the trailer or something where Edward says to Taylor Lautner, aka Jacob, doesn't he own a shirt? I think it's particularly funny. A little in-joke, but I enjoyed it. Overall, Eclipse, it really is basically what you expect it to be. It is a Twilight movie. It's got a lot of cheesy romance, and it's got, vampire, werewolf, love, some maybe creepy themes if you think about it. But overall, I really don't see anything problematic with these movies. They are what they are, and honestly, it's nice to see something not aimed at like a hardcore action crowd, and every summer movie has to be this kind of huge exploding thing off the screen. And it's nice to see something that plays things a little more closely to its chest. I know that sounds rather ridiculous to say when in reference to the Twilight franchise, but I actually think it's true. Overall, I actually would recommend Eclipse. It actually stands quite good on its own, or quite well on its own. There's a lot of things that it makes reference to. Obviously, you won't have a clue what's going on, but overall, like I said, as a film itself, This is the best of the Twilight franchise. David Slade did a really good job here. He definitely grounded the material a lot more. And that's the one last thing I wanted to say. When I mentioned earlier that I'm not sure Eclipse is my favorite movie, because while New Moon did have a lot of problems, I really enjoyed Chris White's direction. How he made it kind of like a fantasy. He made it feel like a fantasy movie, and I think I like that a little more than the grounded direction. Because David Slade sticks a little closer to Hardwick's direction, which I didn't like. He improves on it, but it's still not exactly preferred in my mind. Overall, though, Eclipse is a fantastic movie. I may change my mind second time seeing it when it comes out on video. If you don't like Twilight, you know what? Maybe you should give it a try. If you do, you'll definitely want to check this out.